So, since it's still holiday time, and although I never saw the ad that James talked about, we're all probably not that far away from being in our togs at the beach or hopefully somewhere else fun. I thought that maybe today you don't want to think too hard. So I thought that I would like to share a story with you. It's a story that goes with the kinds of images that you see on the screen, so you might guess what the story is. These images were not part of the original story, surprise, surprise. But that is pretty much what we associate with the story nowadays. And it's a very appropriate story for Mission Sunday. It's the story of St. Patrick. St. Patrick is considered to have begun a evangelism movement that transformed Ireland, and from Ireland swept out into Scotland, down through England and into Europe over the 2 centuries that followed his ministry. So I've been reading some of his writing, and it was really fascinating. So I thought I'd like to share a bit of that with you. If you're lucky enough to go to holiday in Dublin, has anyone been on holiday in Dublin? Lorraine. So Lorraine, did you go to the old library at Trinity College? There it is. Now, you might choose to go to there if you're interested in old books, especially old illuminated manuscripts. That's the manuscripts that the priests and the brothers used to draw on and copy hundreds of years ago. And the famous Book of Kells, which is probably one of the most famous illuminated manuscripts, is actually in this library with, as you can see in the next slide, thousands and thousands of other notable books. That's just one side. The other side is exactly the same. You can imagine how many books they have there. Now, in this library, if you knew where to look, you might be lucky enough to see a small and quite dull-looking book called the Book of Armagh. And inside this book, on very fragile pages, is the oldest surviving copy of St. Patrick's 2 authentic letters. He wrote 2 letters that are considered historically authentic, that they actually came from St. Patrick because of other evidence. The first letter is called Letters to the Soldiers of St. Coroticus, and it was quite an explosive letter objecting to slavery. And the other letter is usually called the Confessions of St. Patrick, and it was probably written because of the lashback against his first letter. So the copies in this library were written in 807, which is 3 centuries, 300 years after Patrick died. All the older copies perished in things like Viking raids or fires or floods, or they were just randomly lost. But these copies in this book are considered by historians to be genuine. They're authenticated by other old copies and by fragments elsewhere. So when we read these documents, we can be fairly confident that we are reading the writing of St. Patrick. And this is the only historical evidence that's considered to be rigorous of who St. Patrick was and what he did. Because there's many stories about St. Patrick, but these stories date from much later than when he was alive, and they're considered to be more like myths. But these 2 letters were written by him. Now, when I read them, I found them fascinating, and they impacted my faith. So I thought maybe you might get something from them as well. So I'm going to tell you the authentic historical story of St. Patrick, who he really was and what he really did, as comes through these 2 documents. Okay, so to understand St. Patrick's story, you first need to understand his world. So he grew up in Britain. At the time, Britain was part of the Roman Empire, And so what was happening in the Roman Empire at that time? So we're going to look at that first. In 313 years after the history chop of Christ, the Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian, and Christianity became legal in the Roman Empire. Before that, many Christians were like sent to the gladiators, to the lions, whatever. But in 313, when the emperor became a Christian, it became legal to be a Christian. You were not persecuted. In 325, there was an amazing council of church leaders from all the branches of the church currently operating throughout the world. And it was called the Council of Nicaea. You've probably heard of the Nicene Creed. That was put together at that council with input from all the churches that currently operated in the world. In 380, Christianity was made the official religion of the Roman Empire by Emperor Theodosius in the Edict of Thessalonica. So suddenly, from being a religion that you were persecuted and maybe killed if you held, it became the religion you had to have. It was the official religion. And 5 years after that, in 385, is the probable birth of St. Patrick. So those were the things that happened just before he was born. His family was wealthy, and they lived in a Roman villa in Britain, which is really like a working farm. The picture there, the building is not the Roman villa, the ruins of the Roman villa. So it shows you like the size of it. That is an actual Roman villa. And the place that he was born and lived in was probably a building along those kinds of lines. His family was wealthy, so they were farmers. They probably owned slaves as well as servants. And his family was Christian. They were good Romans, they were Christian. And his grandfather was a priest, and this predated the unmarried celibate priest requirement. So he was able to have a wife and children and grandchildren. And Patrick's father was a deacon of the church. So that was when Patrick was born, that was what he was born into. In 410, so just a little while after that, the Roman legions started retreating from Britain. This was the beginning of the collapse of the Roman Empire. They had to go back closer to home because of political threats. They removed themselves from Britain. And in 461 is considered to be likely death of St. Patrick. And in 476, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire abdicated. So he lived in a very pivotal political time. Christianity had just become the official Roman Empire religion, and law and order was breaking down because the Roman legions were leaving Britain, which resulted in the countries around Britain, in Ireland and in Scotland, thinking, oh, good, now we can attack them. So they sent raids all along the coasts of Britain and through inland from Scotland. And so it was quite a dangerous time also to live. And this accounted for one of the most transforming event of Patrick's life. One night, a group of Irish raiders, we've got a little artwork of them there. Yes, there they are. Broke into their family home when Patrick's parents were away. They lived near the coast. They kidnapped Patrick. They kidnapped every other person who would be useful as a slave, and they killed everyone else. Now, this is what Patrick says in his letter. He says, I was captured when I was just short of my 16th birthday, so he was 15. At a time when I had no real knowledge of God, I was led away as a slave to Ireland, as were so many thousands of others. Patrick says they were scattered among the hordes of barbarians who live at the edge of the world. That was a very Roman perspective. To the civilized Roman Empire, places outside of it were considered primitive, savage, ignorant, and enemies. And that's where Patrick was heading. he was sold as a slave to an Irish farmer. Now, the photos that you'll see coming up are photos, more recent, like today, kind of photos, but of the area it's considered that he lived in when he was a slave. So this is the kind of environment that he lived in. He became a shepherd in one of the most inhospitable and remote parts of Ireland, on the rugged west coast, which was far away from the east coast ports, which did actually have some Roman British people living in them for trade purposes. So he was definitely right away from there and in the midst of these barbarians. Okay, so Patrick writes, I had to stay overnight in the woods or mountains through snow and frost and rain. Even though he'd been brought up as a Christian in Britain, Patrick says that he had abandoned God and he did not follow God's ways. But in this bleak and dangerous environment, at absolute rock bottom, with no hope of change, God became real to him. Patrick writes, it was here in Ireland that God first opened my heart, so that even though it was a late start, I became aware of my failings and began to turn with my whole heart to the Lord my God, for he looked down on my miserable condition and had compassion for me, young and foolish as I was. Remember, he was 15 when he was taken into this. He cared for me before I even knew who he was, before I could tell the difference between right and wrong. He protected me and loved me, even as a father does his own child. Day by day, I began to pray more frequently, and more my love of God and my faith in him began to increase. Patrick explained that I didn't go to Ireland willingly the first time. I almost died there. But it turned out to be good for me in the end, because God used the time to shape and mold me into something better. He made me into what I am now, someone very different from what I once was, someone who can care about others and work to help them. Before I was a slave, I didn't even care about myself. In some ways, Patrick's experience is like Joseph's in Genesis in the Bible, who was sold by his brothers into slavery, but ends up saying to his brothers, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Now, after around 6 years as a slave, Patrick had a dream in which he heard a voice saying, soon you will be going home. Then a short time after that, he had another dream in which the voice said, your ship is ready. And he decided to escape. Now, this was very dangerous to do. If he was caught, it meant death. He had to make his way to a port which was 200 miles away from where he was being kept as a slave on the opposite coast of Ireland. He had to cross the whole country through the wild, treacherous, boggy interior. So lots of bogs and dangerous wildlife. And in addition, anyone who caught him on the way could kill him. He was an escaped slave. His life was worth nothing. He would have been 22 years old at the time when he did this, 22 years old. He writes, I left trusting in God who took care of me on my journey, and I wasn't afraid, at least until I came to the ship. When he got finally to the ship, the captain of the ship refused to take him. As an escaped slave, he could have been dangerous to them. Leaving in fear and not knowing what to do now, he headed back to his last shelter that he'd found, praying. But before he'd even finished his prayer, one of the sailors came running after him and said he could come with them after all as crew. And so he finally was able to make his way back to Britain. Patrick writes, after many years, I finally returned home to my family in Britain. They took me in. They must have been like, they would have never expected to see him again. Slaves did not return. Their long-lost son, and begged me earnestly that after all I'd been through, I would never leave them again. You can understand that. One night at home, however, Patrick had another vivid dream. And he writes, it was a man named Victoricus coming to me as if he was arriving from Ireland. With him, he brought a huge number of letters. On the first letter, it said, the voice of the Irish. When he began to read this letter, he writes that all of a sudden, I heard the voices of those Irish who live near the woods of Foclut, near the Western Sea. That was where he was held as a slave. They called out to me with a single voice, we beg you, holy boy, come here and walk among us. I felt my heart breaking and was not able to read any more, and so I woke up. Now, Patrick didn't actually go back to Ireland then for maybe 20 years, and it's not really clear what he did in that time, but clearly he did train as a priest during that time. He doesn't tell us how long he took to make the decision to return to Ireland, and it was a huge decision, because as an escaped slave, he was going back into a land which could have killed him for being an escaped slave. He writes that God chose me to be his assistant, but I was slow to do as his Spirit suggested. But he had mercy on me many times because he saw that I was ready. I just didn't know what to do under the circumstances. Now, Patrick, we think Patrick of, this mighty figure, but he was not at all confident of his abilities because he'd missed out on a huge chunk of his Roman education since he was captured at 15 years old. So he'd missed the last and most important third section of Roman education, where the boys were trained in rhetoric and public speaking. So this meant that he didn't have the expected skills for a Roman Christian priest. He writes, I am very ashamed and afraid to show just how awkward my writing is. I am not able to explain things in just a few words, like those who can write briefly. My mind and my spirit can't even work together so that my words say what I really feel inside. But Patrick finally got and accepted the chance to return to Ireland as a bishop of the church. Now, there'd been one earlier bishop in Ireland who'd only really worked on the east coast in those communities that had a few British Roman citizens. And he'd worked with those British Roman people who lived there, but he'd left because it was too hard and he wasn't really making any headway. Patrick was determined to reach every part of Ireland with the good news of Christ. I have never had any motive in my work except preaching the good news and its promises. That is the only reason I returned here to Ireland, a place I barely escaped from alive. He writes a lot about what Jesus, Paul, and other scriptures say of the importance of reaching everyone. Scripture says, I will place you like a lamp among the non-believers so that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth. His mission was very successful, particularly amongst slaves who were at the very bottom of Irish society. Many women, probably the next rung up, also responded to his message and became Christians. Even highborn women, the daughters of Irish kings, listened to his message and became Christians. Now, Patrick understood the Irish culture really well. He'd lived there as a slave. He understood how essential it was to have the permission of the Irish king of an area so that you could travel through the area safely, because Ireland was just a hodgepodge of kingships, and each area had its own rules, and the people that lived in other areas weren't allowed into the neighbouring area. They could be killed if they were. The only people that were allowed to freely travel were the king or the king's family. So the first thing that Patrick did was he would first visit the king of the area and he would pay them money so that he could work there. And then he'd work first with the existing Christians, who were generally slaves captured from Christian Britain, and then establishing Christian community into which many other people were drawn. So that was like his method as he went from place to place. Now, Patrick would also befriend the sons of kings, and he would pay them to travel to the surrounding area with him and introduce him to the new king. So he was pretty smart in how he worked it all out. His efforts to reach all parts of Ireland with the gospel message brought many people into relationship with God. He writes, "I travelled everywhere among great dangers. I even went to the most remote parts of the island, places at the very edge of the world, places no one had ever seen before, to baptise and ordain clergy and confirm people in the faith." How wonderful it is that here in Ireland, a people who never had any knowledge of God, who until now have worshipped idols and impure things, have recently become a people of the Lord and are now called children of God. Now, sadly, people in the established Christian church in Britain started to push back negatively on what Patrick was doing in Ireland. And he wrote the Confessions letter, this one that I'm talking about, to try to explain and answer their criticisms. So the letter starts, "I am Patrick, a sinner, the most unsophisticated and unworthy among all the faithful of God. Indeed, to many, I am the most despised. I have thought about writing this letter for a long time, but I kept putting it off until now. I've been afraid that people would laugh at the way I write. I write Latin as if it were a foreign language. Any reader can easily see what kind of education I had. Many people have tried to stop my mission in Ireland. I know they've talked to one another behind my back and said, 'Why does this man want to work among these barbarians who don't know God?' I know they didn't say these things out of hatred, but because it genuinely seemed foolish to them. I know, and they were right, that I seemed like an uneducated bumpkin. I didn't understand as I do now the grace that God had granted to me." He pleaded in the letter for the chance to remain in Ireland and not to be recalled home to Britain. "May God never permit me to be separated from his people, for whom he worked so hard here at the end of the earth. If I have ever done anything worthwhile for the God I love, I ask that I might be allowed to die here for his name with these converts and slaves, even if it means that I won't have a marked grave or that my body is torn apart piece by wild animals." So he was an amazing man. And this is what I've learned from Patrick. Firstly, the courage to trust God. Patrick lived courageously. He was prepared to do whatever it was that he believed God called him to do. He writes, "God has helped me to keep my faith through difficult times so that I can fearlessly offer myself as a kind of living sacrifice to Christ. He has taught me to trust him without any limits." The second thing I've learned is that Patrick pioneered a method of evangelism that he crafted out of his knowledge of the culture, and he built it in relationships. He was prepared to be different, even shockingly different from the established church, if that was what was needed to reach the Irish people. He writes of his paying money to the kings in each area he was working. "You all know very well how I paid out this money to those in power in those regions I have visited frequently. I'm not sorry that I paid out bribes. In fact, I'm not finished yet. I spent money now, and I will spend even more. By the power of God, I may even spend my own life for their souls." He believed that it is us ourselves who are God's message to the world, who we are and how we act. He wrote, "You are a letter of Christ. You are a letter of Christ for the work of salvation to the ends of the earth, written on your hearts, not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God." Unlike some of his Roman British counterparts, he believed that God valued insignificant and marginalised people, and he was prepared to spend his own life reaching them, saying, "Even ordinary, unsophisticated people were created by God." He was incredibly faithful in obedience to God's call. He writes, "The love of Christ carried me here to be a help to these people for the rest of my life, if I may be worthy, and to work for them with humility and in sincerity. I can testify that the good news has been preached to the very edge of the inhabited world." And his love for God was the most important part of his life. He writes, "From where did I get such wisdom? It certainly wasn't from inside myself. I didn't know my future, and I had no great knowledge of God. And later on, who was it that gave me such a wonderful and life-giving gift? The gift to know and love God." So hopefully in those writings from so many 100 years ago of a person who stepped way beyond what we might expect to do in our lives, you've got something that encourages you in your life. I'd like to finish by praying a blessing prayer that is inspired by Patrick's life. And each little 2-line bit has a third line that says, "Watch over us and protect us." So when we get to that third line each time, I'd love it if you joined in that prayer, because this is our prayer. In life's blessing and in joy, when everything goes our way, watch over us and protect us. In hesitancy and uncertainty, when we don't know what to do, watch over us and protect us. In disaster and in grief, when we feel very alone, watch over us and protect us. In carrying your light, in combating darkness, watch over us and protect us. In all our beginnings, and at each ending, watch over us and protect us. In the name of the sacred three, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, watch over us and protect us.